down because Reeve is our friend, and it's like introducing your cousin to another cousin, and it seems weird to say, oh, and Dr. Bill, meet Dr. Sue, but this is the formal part, and it's a wonderful thing to read. Reeve Lindbergh, daughter of aviator authors Charles A. and Anne Morrow Lindbergh, was born in 1945 and grew up in Connecticut. After graduating from Radcliffe College in 1968, she moved to Vermont, where she lives on an old farm near St. Johnsbury, Vermont, with her husband, writer Nat Tripp. Reeve is the author of more than 24 books for children and adults. Her work has also appeared in magazines and periodicals, including New York Times, the New York Times Book Review, The New Yorker, The Washington Post, among many others. She is active with libraries and other nonprofit organizations in Vermont and nationally. You all know that because you know her in so many ways. She helps us. I will not stumble through a long-winded introduction. You know her for all the wonderful things she does. Please welcome Reeve Lindbergh.
So much. Oh my goodness, look at you all. Thank you so much for being here. I'm just very touched and thrilled to be here with you. I have so many people to thank, and I think what I'm going to do is just thank all of you right now, whoever you are, however we all know each other, and then I'm going to read my acknowledgments, which is just one paragraph. At book signings and book programs, what I really like to do is to read and then have people ask questions or make comments as they feel inclined. So what I said was, heartfelt and delighted thanks to the team at Brigantine Media, Neil, Janice, and Adrian Rafel, for their long friendship, steadfast encouragement, and thoughtful, thorough, and meticulous editing of this book. Thanks, too, for the unending affection and support of family members and friends, including the End of the Road Writers Group and the Good Living Center Memoir Writing Group. Some of you are here, many of you are here. And the tennis group. I am so deeply grateful to you all. This book, Two Lives, is actually not about schizophrenia, as a friend of mine asked. Is this about schizophrenia? Didn't you, Harmon? Harmon Clark, right back there. I said, I hope not. But it is about the two lives that I think I live. The strongest, warmest, and in a sense, most present and nourishing life is right here with all of you on the farm, with Nat, with the children and grandchildren coming through, with the sheep and the chickens and the dogs and all the rest of it. But I think I'll just read you the first chapter of the book. And if you get bored and itchy and start moving around, I'll skip a little bit. But I think I might just read it to you. It's not too long, but it gives you really the core of what I'm trying to say. The book is full of silly pieces and not too silly pieces. I talk about airplanes, and I talk about chickens, and I write about a number of family members, and some of them I didn't know until about 10, 15 years ago, but love them quite a lot, all the same. And some of the kind of unusual things that happen when you are born into a family like mine, and how I try to kind of normalize experience, however it seems to shift and change and surprise me. So here we go. I often think I live two lives, one in the foreground and the other in the background, each life taking its turn. I have a real or normal life in the country where my husband and I live on an old farm at the end of a dirt road. We wear comfortable shoes, write books, raise sheep and chickens, are active in community life, and welcome our children and grandchildren whenever they come to visit. There's also an entirely different Lindbergh life, which requires putting on somewhat less comfortable clothes and traveling to places away from the farm where I attend meetings and give talks, and where there are no chickens except for the kind on the menu, followed by words like cordon bleu and à la king and Kiev. In this second life, I stand up in front of groups of people and talk a little about the books I have written for children and adults, and a lot about the lives of my late parents, Charles A. and Anne Morrow Lindbergh. I've spoken about my parents on college campuses and Air Force bases, in museums and libraries and schools, to children and to adults around the country for many decades. When I have finished with the meetings or the talks, I come home to Vermont, change clothes, and emerge from the limbo of travel and from my Lindbergh life. I settle down with my husband, the dogs, the sheep, the chickens, immersing myself in farm and community until the next time when I put on my other wardrobe again and out I go. Maybe it's a strange way to live, coming and going and switching focus completely between one life and the other, moving from the present to the past, not even my own past, but my parents', and back again. Still, I've done this for so long that it feels like just another part of my routine, like going to the farmer's market or taking one of the dogs to the vet. One of the chief differences is that in my Lindbergh life, there are different questions to answer. Instead of, how long has she been limping? Or, do you want a bag for those? It's, what's your favorite memory of your father? Or, did your mother teach you to write? Or, what can you tell us about the Lindbergh kidnapping? Or, did your father really have other families? These questions are now so familiar that they don't trouble me much, though I can remember when some of them did. I first began to live two lives not long after my father's death in 1974. Before that, my mother and father spoke for themselves, if they chose to speak at all. Most of their communication with the world was done in writing. Between the two of them, they published more than 20 books about their lives and reflections over the years. My father rarely spoke in public during my childhood in the late 1940s and the 50s, though he had done so before I was born. He made speeches on behalf of the future of aviation after his 1927 flight from New York to Paris when he was in his mid-20s. And he spoke out against America's entrance into the Second World War as part of the now controversial isolationist movement when he was in his late 30s. Toward the end of his life, when he was in his 60s and I in my late teens and 20s, he began to speak out again. This time, he talked about his growing concern for the environment worldwide and his conviction that we must achieve balance between the rapid development of technology and the preservation of nature. He spoke in the House chamber in Juneau, Alaska, in support of a bill that State Senator Lowell Thomas Jr. was proposing for the protection of Arctic wolves. He spoke to a radio audience in the Philippines on behalf of what was then called the monkey-eating eagle, but is now known as the Philippine eagle and recently has been proclaimed the national bird of the Philippines. He gave a speech in 1973 at his boyhood home in Little Falls, Minnesota, in which he reminisced about summers sleeping on the screen porch of that home not far from the banks of the upper Mississippi River. He told the audience how very pleased he was that his boyhood home was now a national park, named in honor of his own father, C.A. Lindbergh. My father had come to believe that the establishment of parks and wilderness areas was a far greater sign of human progress than anything technology had achieved. I wasn't present for the speech itself, but have read it in print and have seen and heard him deliver it on film. He died in Maui, Hawaii in 1974, only a year later. I like to think of my father returning to his childhood home as he neared the end of his life, remembering his Minnesota boyhood and telling a local audience what he had come to care about more than anything else in the course of a full and adventurous life. I knew him best during this time, his conservation years, when his focus was absolute, as it had always been absolute, on whatever project or passion engaged him. He talked fervently about his efforts to save the monkey-eating eagle in the Philippines, the blue whale in Japan, and the wildlife of East Africa. He was so electrically energetic that even when he was away, his influence remained and reverberated throughout the house. My mother was a different story entirely. During my childhood, Our father was present even in his absence, his energy, his rules, his discipline lingering in the house, as did the woodsy outdoor scent of his winter jacket in the hall closet. Our mother, however, had the ability to be absent within her presence. She was completely with me, especially when I needed her. She always listened to my stories, always took my physical and emotional complaints seriously, and did not disappear into the world for weeks or months the way our father did. Still, she could go so deeply into herself when I was sitting right there next to her. Her eyes would look off and away through the window over the mudflats and marsh grasses of Long Island Sound, one hand fingering a brooch at her neck. I remember it as a cameo in a silver frame with a bouquet of flowers against a black background, all fashioned of tiny, colorful, semi-precious stones. It made me think of the micro-mosaics here in the gallery, very much like that. I knew then that she was still there with me, but that she was also somewhere else. It was my mother who provided the steady, gentle background of my earliest days, in her knee-length floral print dresses and her dark, curly hair held up and back at the sides in what I later learned was a common 1940s style, a kind of upward roll on both sides of the face with another roll over the forehead. My mother's coiffure was looser, curlier, and much less Hollywood glamorous than Betty Grable's or Ava Gardner's, but her hairdresser may have been trying for the same effect. My mother spoke in public only occasionally when invited to do so by an organization with which she was associated, or by family members and friends. She liked to read aloud a piece she'd carefully written ahead of time for the event, which might be an alumni program at Smith College, her granddaughter's graduation at Middlebury, or a talk given to members of the Cosmopolitan Club in New York City. When my parents spoke in public, there was rarely a question period after the talk. My father disliked being questioned to begin with, and had been uncomfortable with what he called the press ever since his flight to Paris in 1927. My mother said that once, when they were about to embark on one of their early survey flights together, they flew over the pole to Asia, tracking early routes or establishing early routes around the world for the first airline companies, and they were about 25 years old at that time. She would have been 25, he 27. Anyway, they would be just about to leave, and a reporter begged my father to reveal at least which direction they were planning to take on their journey. My father responded solemnly, "Up." Over the course of his lifetime, my father became increasingly adept at disappearances, even in Little Falls, Minnesota in 1973. I cannot believe he would have been available to the crowd the way other speakers are after giving a talk. I imagine him slipping away before anybody in the audience could approach him, safe in the protective custody of the Minnesota Historical Society. My mother, too, always had protectors for her speeches. I was often one of them, in the form of companions who took her away to find a cup of tea or a place to rest following her presentation. It was characteristic of both my parents to be quite open to the world in their spoken or written words, but much less willing to share themselves in person. Unlike my parents, I always expect to have questions from the audience after I give a talk. I often enjoy the questions part of the program best, in fact, because it feels like a conversation. I am relieved of the burden of doing all the talking, and I don't have to listen to myself, which can become tedious if you offer more or less the same presentation to different groups, as I sometimes do when I talk about my family. Sometimes a tactful moderator asks whether there are things I prefer not to talk about, questions that might be painful or difficult for me to answer. I always say that I will answer any question I'm asked to the best of my ability, though there may be questions to which I don't know the answer. A wonderful thing that has happened to me after many years of speaking in public is that I have completely lost my fear of answering questions and have gained the great freedom of simply telling the truth as far as I know it. I'm pretty sure I'm not alone in living two lives. I think most people do this to some degree. When a person gets up in the morning and goes to school or to work, he or she leaves an at-home self behind. Salespeople have salesmanship selves. Office workers have at-the-office selves. Any teacher, whether in kindergarten or in college, has developed a teaching self. A teacher needs to be on in a certain way, just as an actor is on for the theater, film, or television. When the school day is over, or the cameras have stopped rolling, or the stage lights have dimmed, then you can be off, just yourself. The difference for me is that I'm never entirely off. Even when I think I'm completely free of it, Lindbergh life seeps into my everyday existence at the most unexpected moments. Then I find I have to move from a kind of low-key daily consciousness concerned with things like laundry, shopping, working in my garden, and asking people to bake pies for the library bake sale. And, let's see, and I move to another way of thinking entirely, a state of mind blended from instinct, training, and long experience. This is the way I confront my family's past. Hardly a day goes by, and never as much as a week, that I do not receive correspondence related to my father's aviation career, my parents' personal lives, my mother's and father's historical archives, and literary legacies. One day, for instance, I received 2 requests, one from a group hoping to name their new in-flight magazine Lindbergh, and and another for an interview to discuss my father's 1927 flight to Paris. I was able to respond to both requests easily. In the first case, the family still follows my parents' policy not to use their names or likenesses for commercial purposes. In the second, I'd be glad to talk to the historian about my father's flight to Paris, but since it occurred 18 years before I was born, everything I know about it comes from his book. My father rarely even mentioned that flight to me. If I asked him about it, he invariably responded, "Read my book." Eventually, I did. I read all of his books and all of my mother's, and I keep on reading them because I need to. Most of the ongoing literary responsibilities came to me after my parents died because I've worked with editors and publishers in my own writing life for more than 30 years. I've also dealt with my mother's and father's letters, manuscripts, and archives since the death of first one and then both of my parents. Even though my father has been dead for more than 40 years, and my mother for 15, a little more, their written words continue to reverberate in my consciousness, and their lives still trail long tendrils across mine. Hundreds of other people, even now, are just as interested in my family as I am. Some of them are much more interested than I am. Those Lindbergh researchers and biographers and scholars have been so helpful in supplying dates and times and verifying the accuracy of my own memories. How old was I when my father and I had a forced landing together? What year was it when my mother became the first licensed female glider pilot in the United States? I used to pester A. Scott Berg with questions like these when he was writing Lindbergh, his Pulitzer Prize-winning biography of my father. During this time, I was writing my own first memoir, Under a Wing, about growing up in my family. Scott also asked me questions. Yeah, he also asked me questions, but he did so very discreetly and politely. Once, probably because I had expressed astonishment at hearing how many boxes of material he proposed to go through in the Lindbergh collection at the Sterling Library at Yale. 700, he said. He almost complained to me about some of the material he had discovered, items that had been saved by my parents and sent to the university to be kept there in perpetuity. Was it really necessary, he wondered, to save carbon copies of the handwritten notes to our teachers excusing us from school for dental appointments? Small squares of blotting paper, probably made by cutting one of my mother's large desk blotters into smaller pieces, with each square covered with the indecipherable reverse blottings of words from letters or diaries or grocery lists. Did I have any ideas about all this? I told him, because I couldn't resist, that at our home, during my high school years, there were always 2 cardboard boxes sitting at the top of the stairs to the basement. Next to the basement itself was the attached garage where my father kept the station wagon he used for local errands. He also drove this car to New Haven when he carried documents to the Yale archives. One box at the top of the basement stairs by the kitchen, one box was labeled Yale. for the station wagon. The other one was labeled dump. Could the labels or the boxes have been switched? If he hadn't been so well brought up, I think this author would have hung up on me. It sometimes seemed to me that my mother and father either did not know how to separate archival material from what should be considered garbage, or didn't have time to sort the material carefully before bringing the next load of boxes to Yale. My father was usually so meticulous in his habits that I was surprised at some of the things we found when I visited the library a few years ago with my brother Lindbergh, our niece Christina Lindbergh, and our friend and associate assistant Carol Hyman, who is here. Hi, Carol. We were there to help the archivists make sense of some of the more questionable items in the Lindbergh collection. Folders full of brochures for summer camps that we children had attended over the years, along with brochures for summer camps that we did not attend. My brother Land's kindergarten paintings, about which he expressed the opinion that our mother had always had a feeling for fine art. Pale slips of mimeograph notices announcing PTA meetings and teachers' conferences at our schools. None of the archivists had felt that they could discard this material without permission from the family. Poor archivists. We weeded out a good deal of it, though I'm not sure we dared to discard the kindergarten paintings. Despite my occasional complaints, I'm still fascinated by the celebrity that surrounded my parents for most of their lives, no matter how hard they tried to escape it. I have an impulse to explore this phenomenon further, and another even stronger one that wants to do exactly the opposite. Fight against it, wrestle it down to human size by bringing into the picture everything familiar and genuine that I know about my parents. My father's toothbrush, his comb, and the handkerchief in his pocket. The bright Mexican ribbons my mother wore in her hair, her underwear and stockings dripping over the shower curtain railing in the bathroom to dry. The horse chestnut she kept in her coat pockets, shining deep mahogany from the invisible rubbing of her thumb. It seems to me now that fame, like disease or war, is the enemy of normal human life. It certainly was for my parents, especially during their first years together. I was ignorant in my childhood of something that became very clear to me later. My parents had no wish to live in the past for many reasons, but the greatest of these must have been that their early adventures were followed by terrible tragedy. The extraordinary fame of the 1920s and early 30s had directly contributed to the kidnapping death of their first child, Charles, in 1932. After that horror, their lives changed completely. They left America, living for a time in England and in France with my older brothers, John and Land, and they shunned all forms of publicity for the greater part of their lives. Having been robbed of normalcy in a terrible way early on, they understood it for the treasure that it is and tried their best to offer this treasure to their children as we grew up. How little I appreciated their efforts. I hated having to memorize a false surname when we were on vacation. Scott, Spencer, names close enough to our family to remember, though I always forgot which one we were using at the time. How outraged I was if my father made us get up and leave a restaurant because one of the waiters asked for his autograph. How embarrassed I felt. The amount of attention that comes to me because of my parents is a tiny, tiny fraction of what they faced every day during the time I was growing up, and even more before that time. Still, when the past comes calling, whatever my circumstances may be at the time, I immediately snap into Lindbergh mode. I can't help it. Recently, my husband was diagnosed with bladder cancer. A tumor discovered during a checkup was surgically removed the same day. A second surgery followed within the month, and we were plunged into what I think of as cancer limbo, the time when a family knows the disease has struck, but has yet to find out what the prognosis will be. It turned out, after a year or two, it turned out to be very good. I was thinking about my husband's health all the time, driving back and forth with him to a hospital an hour away, feeding the sheep and chickens while trying to keep our spirits up and the two of us fed. He is the cook in the family, wonderful cook, as well as the gardener, and he's much better than I am in both areas. So for me, it was a matter of trying to keep the standards up. Some of our children arrived to help out, and communications within the family were constant and intense. At some time during this period, a friend received an email message from a woman who was aware that he knew me, and my friend sent the message my way, as she had requested. The woman's late father had always thought he might be the missing Lindbergh baby. His daughter attached several photographs to the email to show how much this man had, or believed he had, looked like my father. I was unable to see the resemblance, though he certainly was a good-looking man, and his daughter clearly loved him and respected his belief that he was related to my family. It might have seemed odd to move into Lindbergh mode that week of all weeks, but I did it instinctively. The only answer I had for this woman was one that would disappoint her. It's the same answer I have given over and over for many decades to people who believe that they or one of their relatives is really my long-lost brother, the missing Lindbergh baby. There is no missing Lindbergh baby. I never had a long-lost brother. There was a dead child, my brother Charles, whose body was found a number of weeks after he had been kidnapped from his home in Hopewell, New Jersey in 1932. He was wearing his own clothes with his own teeth in his head, and he was identified by his doctor as well as his father, my father. Still, for some reason, some people have made a mystery of this tragedy for all the 80-odd intervening years. I will never understand how the stark fact of that child's death, a horrific injustice cutting short a life that had barely begun, has been lost again and again in so many bewildering apocryphal stories. The myth of the missing Lindbergh baby, the conspiracy theories implicating either my father, one of my aunts, other household members, or completely unassociated individuals whose names were in the news at the time, including Al Capone. The truth is that a very young child died during the course of a botched kidnapping, and his body was later found in the woods near his home. It was terrible, heartbreaking, and I don't think that my parents ever really got over it. It affected their individual lives and the life of their marriage forever. The fact and manner of my brother's death still shocks me every time something reminds me of it, even though he died more than 8 decades ago and before I was born, and even when I'm in the midst of a present-day family crisis. I can sympathize with someone else's difficult family story, and I can be sorry that another family history has linked itself with my family's long-ago loss. But to feel that sympathy and to be sorry about another family is as far away as I can move from the child who died, my parents' first son, my brother. He, the real child, is the heart of the case and remains close to my heart too, though I never knew him. During our time of medical intensity in cancer limbo, we received many messages and phone calls from our loved ones, our children, my brothers, cousins, nieces and nephews, my husband's family and friends. I also got a call from a beloved half-brother in Europe. I was unaware of this man's existence until 2003, when I traveled overseas to meet my half-brothers and half-sisters, the children of my father's relationships with 3 women he had come to know after the Second World War. These were women who knew each other. 2 of them were sisters. The other was their friend. Our father had visited them all regularly and had provided for them financially and had given them children. I first found out about them through a letter from a half-brother whose mother was still living. He felt very strongly, as his mother did, that the situation should remain private. I did not understand what he meant by the situation until I read the news reports generated by another of these European families. Their mother had died the same year my mother did, and her children saw no reason not to reveal themselves. The remaining 2 of the 3 families followed their mother's wishes, tried to remain out of the public eye. Though they did make friendly contact with our own family, they did so in a very private way. I traveled to Europe and met all of my half-siblings in the summer of 2003. I visited the home of one of the very discreet half-brothers during that summer, and we talked a lot during my visit. We took long walks together, speaking in English or in French, whichever was easiest at the moment. His English is better than my French, so we usually speak English during the telephone calls we have shared regularly over the years since that summer. I have come to know and love this man since our meeting. And I'm glad that we can speak together often. In the midst of our cancer limbo, with doctor's appointments and medical procedures and worry all the time, he called me from Europe, as usual, and I told him the medical situation. He responded with characteristically thoughtful concern, and during the following weeks, he sent several notes and postcards which I carried with me and read over while waiting for my husband's second surgical procedure to be completed. While I was rereading my half-brother's postcards and thinking about his warm-hearted concern for me and my family, I understood something simple yet stunning. It had little to do with jumping in and out of Lindbergh mode, or with celebrity, or even with history. Whatever the trouble, sorrows, or confusion there may be in either or both of my lives, whatever is disturbing, confusing, or bizarre about being a Lindbergh, it has brought me unexpected comfort to know that I do have a long-lost brother, after all. So that's the two lives, at least two. And I wonder if people have questions or comments or anything you want to say or ask or anything at all. Zyba, yeah.
I was wondering, there was $50,000 for the ransom fund.
I don't remember the amount, but it was something like that, yeah.
And they recovered $14,000. Was there the other $36,000? Was it ever?
I don't believe so. Yeah, I don't, of course, as I said, I don't make a real study of that, but there are people who do. But I don't believe, as far as I know, and you could look at the other place that would be able to tell you something, would be the Scott Berg biography. He was incredibly meticulous in his research. So, I mean, he spent a long, long time in the files of the New Jersey State Police Department and interviewed anybody he could find that was still living, who was part of that case. So if there are facts and details, I would go to the Scott Berg book.
Okay.
Yeah. Hey, Jerry.
Three things. I think all of Billy Collins' crowd came here tonight.
Oh, good.
He's reading
What?
some other place in the state, but I think they all came here. Let's see, it was something else. Another question come to me.
Okay, that's fine. He's Swedish. So am I. Yes. Yeah, hi, you're good. Yeah.
So is the writing and reading of this book and bringing it forward in the public eye, is that part of your Lindbergh life? Is it part of your new life? Or is it a place where you're finally integrated the two?
I think it's the way that I bring the two lives together. I think that's what it is. Because they're both real. They both happen. They're both it's part of how I live and who I am. And for me, that's the way. And some of my siblings have not been interested, and they have very much led their own lives, and they're strong people and doing fine. But I think there are people in our family who just don't really want to have anything to do with it, and there are people who take a look at it and engage with it to the extent that they feel comfortable. So, yes.
Do you feel your writing style is more like your father's than your mother's, or totally different and unique in itself?
Well, I've wondered that, but I would probably say it's more like my mother's, because I would love to write like my mother. but my father's writing style is I always thought, I'm not sure I'm absolutely right about this, but that he had a kind of an oratorical style. You know, there was something, not so much that he was making a speech, but that he had long, kind of rolling sentences, and especially in the spirit of St. Louis. And his father was very much a speaker. I don't do that so much. I'm much more, I try to get back to here and now as often as I can, and I think my mother did that too, although her use of her own reading, her education, her was a kind of erudition that I'm not sure I have. I'd like to be down to earth, and I'd like to kind of talk to people. So it's a little different, but perhaps if I were to hope, I would say I probably would want to write more like her. Yeah.
Do you find as the years roll on that there's less attention now just because because it's farther away, younger people are not?
Absolutely. There's a tension in an area. I mean, there is in the aviation world, there's still great interest, and there are people who are attached to some part of the story, and there are people who are very much continue to be tremendously interested in and admiring of my mother and her own work, and that's a whole other side of things. But there is nothing like the attention. They had a kind of a Princess Diana attention, that extraordinary situation where they would appear and just crowds would, ever since the time that he landed in Paris and there were the lights and the thousands of people, he had a letter of introduction in his pocket because he thought nobody would have any idea who this was. And there he was with his letter of introduction and thousands of people and cars and lights. He could barely see to land, and he didn't know what this was. But it just rolled over him and made a great influence, a great difference in his life, just forever. Anything at all? Yes, in the back. Oh, hi.
Where does the book go from here, Reeve? What are some other topics that you deal with?
Where does the book go from here? Neil?
We're hoping for another one.
We're hoping for another one. It happens.
You mean within the book, Bob?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, there's a chapter called Chicken Yoga Rooster Soup.
Ah, yes. There's one, yes. Well,
It goes.
it goes here and there and everywhere. Yeah, there's a little bit about airplanes, a little bit about roosters and yoga, and oh gosh, just everything. A little chapter called Gladiolas, which is sort of about gladiolas and others. Yes.
Do you feel that your father's relationship with your other family in Europe had any negative or observable influences with your mom that when we were growing up, or was that?
I really don't think she knew. And I think she probably chose not to even go there. But I talked to one of my aunts who was very close to my mother, and I don't think there's much that they didn't tell each other. And I asked her in 2003, she was still living, and I asked her whether she thought my mother knew about this. And my aunt said, and it was a wonderful answer, she said she knew something, but she didn't know what she knew. That's the best I can do.
I guess my question was really, did you feel like your father's behavior at home was influenced at all adversely by having another family that he had to consider?
I have no idea I don't know how it was right after the war, so he would have been in, I remember my mother writing that they felt very separate after them, that men and women in some cases really did after that war. You know, the men had been off engaged in that incredible conflict, and the women had become much more independent, and there was a kind of disconnect when the war was over and they came back together. And they had the kind of separation that occurs when a child dies as well. And she had all the responsibility for the five of us who were growing up while he was off, flying off to hither and yon. So I don't know. All I know is that when I met the other children, especially the half-brother that I still talk to a great deal, and I'm still in contact with many of them, but he's the one I can talk to. And I know how he and I were both so angry. Because I think none of the families really knew the full scope of this. There were people who did, but we were both just furious. I was furious for a good 6 weeks, just absolutely. I don't get that kind of furious. And then it kind of went away. And I lost that. I felt very sorry for him. I thought that he had to seal his life into these little pockets. None of them connected with the others. I thought that was very sad. And I guess that's what I ended up with, thinking that's too bad. But I like the people. They were wonderful women, very interesting women, and I thought, gee, these are more like my mother's friends than my father's friends. So, I don't know. Yeah.
Did the two sisters know about each other?
Oh, yeah. They did, but just think, how did that work? Yes, they did. They did. The kids basically grew up together. They aren't so connected now, those cousins, and it's because of this exposure, with one family saying, hey, let it all hang out, and the other family saying, absolutely not, and just, that was very destructive. And one of the things I thought was he never taught them, because they didn't really know who he was when he was with them. They didn't know that he was Charles Lindbergh until after he died. So they knew that their father came occasionally. One of them didn't know he was their father. He said, we thought he was kind of a handyman, traveling handyman, because he used to fix things when he came to the house. But they're very interesting people, very intelligent, very sophisticated. They're kind of amazing. And, but they weren't trained. Boy, we were so trained, which is who you talk to, who you don't talk to. And their mothers did a wonderful job, actually. I mean, it gets you so mixed up about, what's right, what's wrong, what's good, what's bad, what's moral, what's immoral. You think, what is this? It's a puzzler. Yeah.
I have a question for you.
Yes, ma'am.
When we first came to Vermont, we were buying your books for all our friends' children.
For the children.
They were so creative, and they were caring. And in a lot of them, there was such a great sense of humor and so entertaining. So my question is, how did you begin writing these children's books? And the second thing is, and then how did you go from that to writing these very well-written books about your impression of your family, whether they were fiction or
not? Yeah.
the names of the
Oh my goodness, you read that. Yeah, it was fiction, but it was as close as I could get at that time. That's right, thank you.
And so the dementia that you go see happen in your parents.
Yeah.
And you used to talk to the Women's Club.
Oh, yes.
Because you love to speak to older women, and now we're there.
Yeah, and I still like to speak to us.
So my question, to repeat, how did you get involved with
writing for children?
Children's book, and then from there transition into writing about your parents?
Yeah, it wasn't quite like that. I actually wrote the. I'm trying to think. Did I? Yes, I did. I wrote my first novel, sort of autobiographical novel, before I wrote a children's book. And I wrote my first children's book. Actually, it came from the loss of a child. My son, who died at the Midnight Farm. And then after I wrote that book, which was kind of a lullaby, a rhyming book for a sort of go-to-bed picture book kind of thing. And I worked with Amy Ehrlich, wonderful Amy Ehrlich, who was a good friend. And I said, I don't know what I did. I just wrote this poem. And she said, that's a picture book, and I'm going to take it to my publisher. And so after that one, I kind of started thinking about rhyming and reading, because I had been a second grade teacher before I had kids. And I noticed that a lot of the children who have trouble reading can relate much better to rhyming books, much better to the Dr. Seuss, One Fish, Two Fish, than to the picture books that we at that time, or the textbooks certainly that we had at that time for kids learning to read. And I decided, well, I think I'm going to, I don't even know if I decided, but I felt that the rhythm, the rhyme, the pictures, which I couldn't do, but wonderful people could, went together so nicely. And kids began to read with that kind of exposure who had real trouble learning to read. And I discovered that as a teacher, and then kind of worked into the children's books I was writing. And I loved doing it. The last one was Homer the Library Cat in, I think, 2012. But I haven't done that recently. I've been doing some other this kind of work. I don't know, my youngest child is now 31. He said, no offense, Mom, but I prefer nonfiction. It was a pleasure. It is a great pleasure. Anybody else? Wait a second. Yes?
I'm wondering how you think about your audience for this book. And for the previous ones, and I want to hear.
You have an idea?
I have a thought. Yeah.
I don't think of my audience when I'm writing. I really don't. I think about what it is I need to say and what I want to explore, and then as I do a lot of rewriting. I do a first draft and then I just kind of torture the thing. I go back and yeah, you're laughing because you do the same thing, Mary Liz. Right? So,
pays any attention to it, but anything I give her, unless it says revision 17.
No, not quite true, but we have the same feeling about it. But I don't think of the audience. I do think that I have to get as far as I can from sort of being a writer when I'm writing, but that if I start to get stiff and stilted and kind of exposing a theory or something like that, it's not going to work. I kind of have to converse, and sometimes I'll converse and kind of get dreamy and write something that's a little more, oh, I don't know, a little prettier or something. But I have to be careful not to think I'm being a writer, or I get kind of tight. And there's an interesting balance between writing something that makes sense and not trying to be a teacher, or not trying to be something important when you're writing. At least for me, that's how it works. What do you think about?
Well, two things, because I think you really are very adept at bringing a complex story that's widely known, but you can't assume that everybody knows everything. So sort of figuring out how to insert the information in such a way that people are with it, but also it's feeling really intimate.
Oh, that's a wonderful thing to say. Thank you.
And I just think of your writing I see it as an intimate kind of reflection on the evolution of life, and as a daughter, mother, woman, and I found it to be just you're working from the particulars.
Oh, yeah.
From those, there's so much that one can relate to. So I think that the names of the mountains, that one was so helpful to me.
Oh, I'm glad. I'm so glad.
And so I guess I'm not saying you should be thinking of this when you're writing, but I think it's important to recognize that the Lindbergh part is certainly part of your story. Mm-hmm. What you're sharing is very, very broad.
I hope. I mean, that's what I would like. I would like it, as somewhere in there I was talking about, trying to normalize, to personalize, and that comes right out of the background. And, I don't want to talk about airplanes, but I'd be happy to talk about, tree houses, or, the comb and the brush and the bowl full of mush, to be able to, I guess it's really important that we believe we make each other human. And you're always trying to get there in your own life and in terms of others, not making other people to other, even if it's your famous parents. Yeah, Jerry, you remembered.
I remember. You have a wonderful new website.
Oh, that's right. Thank you.
ReeveLindbergh.com.
That's right. Thanks to them. I didn't know.
Every writer likes word of mouth stuff, so if you get people can go to the website, read all about it, and you've got a tour where you're going to be going next.
Oh, yeah.
And next, and after that, all these different wonderful venues. People can put it on their Facebook, they can Twitter it, and they can email it and say, go see Reeve.
That's my publicity agent right there, Jerry Johnson. So thank you very much, Jerry. Great. Anybody else? Thoughts? I'm sorry? Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't see. It's light.
Yeah, I'm interested in knowing, did you know your grandparents on your father's side? And were they famous people? You said that your grandfather was a border?
Oh, he was a farmer, labor politician in Minnesota, and he did stump speeches. He talked a lot. He was a talker, and I didn't know him. I read some of his things that he wrote, and I learned a certain amount about him from the biography of my father. But I did not know either of my grandfathers. They both had died quite a while before I was around, and I knew both my grandmothers, one of them quite well until I was, 7 or 8, because she was one of those grandmothers who gathers all her grandchildren as often as she can, and she was delightful. She taught us to play croquet, and she was a wicked croquet player. And the other one, I only knew my father's mother. She was quite ill, so when I knew her, she had Parkinson's, and she was mostly in bed. I don't remember if I ever saw her standing up, but I learned quite a lot about her since in recent years, and have been quite touched by her. She worked very hard to bring up her son, and her husband was traveling and orating, and he was a representative. My father, he wasn't. His father had 2 half-sisters, but they didn't live with him. And so he was an only child for his mother, and it was very much the 2 of them for a long time. She was with him when he went to college, which he didn't last very long. There's a little piece of there. I ended up going to Madison, Wisconsin, to the School of Engineering to deliver a Lindbergh talk, and I thought, this is the craziest thing I've ever done, because I'm an English major. What am I doing? But I loved the people, I loved the place, and it was a very interesting trip, and it was all because of Jeanette Mayo, whose sister was an alum of the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and her husband, and connected with the School of Engineering where my father was for briefly, 1920 to 1920 and a half, something like that. And then he did not only did he not graduate, but he was asked to leave because he spent all his time on a motorcycle outside. He did not do much in the way of studying. And then he came back, I think he left in 1921, and they invited him back after the Spirit of St. Louis had landed in Paris, and they gave him an honorary degree. Which I thought, honestly. Yes, sorry, you weren't finished.
I have one more question.
Yes.
Where did the other women?
And
they all lived in the same town?
No, well, not when I met their children. They didn't. I think one of them had been a translator, and the others were. One of them was a hat maker. They had come from families, and one of them, the 2 sisters, had come from a family in Moravia that was. I don't know what the background was. The one woman who was not a sister was from quite a well-known family in Germany. She sounded like a lovely person. I have not ever met her, but their families, their homes, their families, the factories, the whole life had been very much destroyed by the war. And these were women who were quite young. They would have been, 30 years younger than my father and my mother, I think. And I don't know, I still don't know. There hasn't been published writing about when they all knew each other or how he met them. But they were all from German families, and they had had tremendous losses. And I think at that time, at the end of the war, there were not so many men available for these women to marry and have children. And the sons and my brothers, those who talked about it, had said that it was devastating. Their lives were devastated. That's as much as I know.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You seem to know so much about your parents. Are there things that you don't?
Probably. I'm sure there are things that I don't know.
I say that because I wonder how many children know so much about this.
I don't think so many, because think about, how often do you have, we have attics, and we have, we don't have trunks anymore, I suppose, but we have drawers in the attic and places, and occasional papers here and there. But I've got Missouri Historical Society and the Yale University Archives and the, it's, I mean, I get, as I said, I get contacted periodically. In fact, I just had a contact from the Missouri Historical Society, which owns a painting about the size of the domes that was given to my parents for their wedding, about 9 foot by 12 by, I guess that's not quite the size of the domes. And they are going to have a big event about this painting that I've never heard of or seen. And they, called and talked about what they were going to do about it, and when they were going to have an exhibit, and would I like to come? And I said, oh, that sounds really interesting. And then I just got an email today saying that everything was delayed because, you'll understand what this happens, Werner, because the freight elevator had a terrible problem. Thank goodness they found it. And this is the way they carry all the art from all over this Missouri Historical Society museum. So they're putting the whole thing off for another 6 months while they do the repairs to the elevator in this building to which my father had given all his artifacts. And I don't think anybody in the family ever saw that painting. I don't know what the story is, but it looks quite magnificent. But that's the kind of telephone calls I get. So, yeah.
Will you do a story on? Will you write a story on your other family members?
I won't. Diane, I won't write about anybody who doesn't want to be written about.
No, like your grandparents.
Oh, that would be nice. There have been quite a few books written about them by real historians. I can write my memories, but I'm not really a historian. But there are some books about them, and they have written books as well. Thank you for the question. Judy, Jen?
I was wondering how your writing life has paralleled your processing of your parents' lives and all of that. If you hear something and you write, just how they parallel.
I think that my writing life, as she asked, has paralleled my connection with my family history. Not so much that I find something out and I write, but it might seep into something that I'm writing. And why am I saying that? When my mother was at the very end of her life, I wrote a diary about her memory loss and the wonderful care she was given by a team of Buddhist caregivers from this area. And all the things that happened, all the people who came, all the things she said. I was writing this down as a journal. And my editor for a previous book called and said, so what are you working on now? And I said, I'm not doing any work. I'm keeping a diary about my mother's health and what we're going through. And he said, I want to see it. And I thought I wasn't writing. But that became the book called No More Words, about the last time of my mother's life. It often parallels, I think, more than I even know. And sometimes it kind of goes underground like a river, and it comes up again, and there it is. It's a good question. Yeah. Oh, hi, Beth.
So I'm just interested. Your dad and your mom were huge adventurers, and they took risk.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a big thing about getting a plane flying halfway across the border, right? I'm just wondering how that affected you and your siblings. Was there a sense in the family to do that, to be that kind of a person, or did anybody in your become that kind of a person? Do you feel like you became one of those kinds of people?
I don't think I became that kind of an explorer. I think I was, because of course I grew up with my mother when that had all stopped. And she was home, and he was coming and going all the time, but that didn't look like fun to me. That was being away, and I liked the way my mother lived. But I think it absolutely affected my brothers, their sons. It was more a kind of a direct male thing, I think. And somebody could disagree with me, but I think that's how it went. And I have a nephew, Eric Lindbergh, you'll see him in the papers now and then on TV. He's a pilot who's really interested in silent flight and environmentally sound flight and ways of reducing the use of aviation fuel, which someday they'll maybe figure out. But mainly, you know, I've got a brother who lives in Brazil and has been doing some interesting things with endangered species and all kinds of things. And another one spends a lot of time back and forth from West Virginia to Chile, where he's working with kind of, I think it's mostly, was it cranberry farming? He's doing some farming stuff around hither and yon around the world. And you have this sense of that same drive to do something kind of on the frontiers. And yet, and there's my brother Land, who is in Manila, Montana, and most of his work has either been cattle ranching or really kind of broad-based conservation work in that state. So I feel as if that's more the way the men have been, and that the women, my sister and I, were much more interested in writing and teaching. It's pretty much what we wanted to do. Raising chickens. Yes, in the back.
Traveling across the United States.
Oh, I'm sorry. I have somebody right here with a very soft voice, and then we'll go to your red hat. Go ahead.
Oh,
you. Yeah.
Where did I stop?
You should start again.
I'm fortunate to have met you before, and I'm very happy in my life to have met again time to meet you.
Oh, thank you.
I feel very lucky in my life. But your family certainly talked at our table, our family, about all the times while the kids were growing up in our family. You were a close family to us.
Oh, I'm so glad. I'm so glad. Because I think that was, for them, I think that was very warming, that people felt affectionate toward them, that it wasn't all sensation and kind of crazy things, but that there was an intimacy. Yeah, no.
This was meeting you people in your home, your close friends are
I'm glad.
to talk about it as a family, about what's going on in the different.
Thank you very much. And I interrupted you in this lovely hat.
Well, it's very much a pleasure and an honor to be here today to listen to you. And I'm very grateful for all you said, putting the cards on the table and telling it the way it is and the way it was. The thing is that you obviously traveled all over the United States, but did you ever go across to Canada?
Did I ever been to Canada? Oh, yes. To give a talk? I have once. I have. Into Montreal, a friend of mine invited me to talk with a group that she's part of there, and I had loved it. It was a very, very interesting group.
My friend and I, we've come today from Mansonville, just on the other side, Cotton Township. I would like to invite you to come and give a talk.
Oh my! Well, thank you. We will talk. Thank you. Thank you so much.
I don't want to cut anybody off, but if we stop now in this formal part, you can talk with Reeve individually for not 2 hours, because she wants to go home and Nat wants to go home. But we have some beer and some wine and some snacks, and there are people who are standing in the back, and maybe they'll rotate in and they can stand in here. And I'm not going to say, is there one last question, because that's the one that always opens up like the next hour.
That's fine. That's fine. And I'm here. I'm around. Thank you.
And the books are here to be bought and signed. Would you like water?